Hey there, everyone! Welcome back to the English Pod community. I'm Blake, and today we're diving into a topic that I know a lot of you are excited about: how to sound like a native English speaker in 2025. I'm sure you've all heard that English can be tricky, and while you might be great at grammar, the way we speak day to day is a whole other story. But don't worry, today we're going to break it all down into easy tips and tricks. I'll even share some of my own experiences, so let's get into it. Okay, so I'll be honest with you. I wasn't always this comfortable with my English. When I first moved to the US, I was still getting used to all the little expressions and slang. One time I was talking to a friend about a party and I said, "It was very good." My friend just looked at me and said, "Very good? That's so formal. Say it was awesome or amazing." I was confused at first, but that's when I realized how important it is to use everyday phrases that native speakers use. So, let's start with those kinds of phrases today. Tip 1, keep it casual with contractions. Let's talk about contractions first. If you want to sound like a native speaker, you have to start using them all the time. We use contractions in almost every conversation. Instead of saying I am, we say I'm, and instead of I will, we say I'll. It's that simple, but it makes a huge difference. In fact, the more contractions you use, the more natural your speech will sound. I remember the first time I heard someone say, "I'm going to do that," instead of "I am going to do that." At first I thought it was just casual slang, but then I realized that's how people really speak. Once I started saying things like "I'm gonna" or "I don't know" in my own conversations, it felt way more relaxed. And honestly, it helped me fit in better. So, try it out. Say, "I'm not sure" instead of "I am not sure." Or, "I'll call you later" instead of "I will call you later." It's a small change, but it makes a big difference. Tip 2, use real-life expressions. Let's talk about expressions you'll hear every day. Native speakers use a lot of simple phrases that make their speech sound natural. For example, if you're planning to hang out with someone, you might say, "Let's grab a coffee," instead of "Would you like to go get coffee?" It's just more casual and fun. I remember when I first heard someone say, "Let's hang out soon." I was a little confused because I was used to saying, "Would you like to meet up?" But this phrase was so much more relaxed, and after a while, I started saying it too. Now, it feels totally natural when I invite my friends to get together. Another good one is when you're asking someone how they're doing. You don't need to ask, "How are you today?" like a robot. You can say, "What's up?" or "How's it going?" These are phrases that native speakers use all the time, and they make you sound way more natural. I remember asking my friend, "How are you?" once, and she laughed and said, "I'm doing great, but you sound like you're giving a speech." I realized then that using more natural, everyday phrases helps you sound more like a native speaker. Tip 3, master the rhythm and flow. Next up, we need to talk about rhythm in English. English isn't spoken like some languages where each word is said with the same emphasis. In English, we stress certain words in a sentence. For example, in the sentence, "I'm going to the store," the word store is stressed, and the rest of the sentence flows around it. This is what gives English its rhythm, and it's something you want to get comfortable with. I had a moment in college when I first started to really understand this. I was in a group project, and I had to present some information. I was so focused on the details of my project that I didn't realize how stiff I was sounding. Then, one of my classmates said, "Blake, try not to sound like you're reading from a textbook. Just talk like you're telling us a story." That's when I started practicing how to speak more naturally, using rhythm and flow. I began to stress the important words and let the sentence naturally roll off my tongue. When you speak, try not to rush through the words. Instead, focus on how the sentence sounds. Pause for a second when needed and let your words flow. For example, in the sentence, "I'm going to see a movie later," you might stress the word movie because it's the most important part of the sentence. Tip 4. Practice with everyday situations. Another great way to sound like a native speaker is by practicing real-life situations. Think about the types of things you say every day. How do you order food at a restaurant? How do you ask for directions? How do you make plans with friends? These are all moments where you can practice natural English. I remember when I first moved to the US, my mom told me to practice these things every day. For example, when we went to the grocery store, she would always say, "Blake, go ahead and ask the cashier how their day is going." At first, it felt awkward, but the more I practiced it, the more confident I became. Now, when I'm out and about, I find myself having these casual conversations with strangers without thinking about it. It's all about getting comfortable with those everyday situations. All right, let's dive into another tip that will really help you sound natural when speaking English: showing confidence. This is one of those things that you might not realize, but the way you carry yourself when speaking makes a huge difference. If you sound confident, you'll automatically come across as more natural, even if you're still learning. Let me tell you a personal story about confidence. Back when I was in college, I had this one professor who was a native English speaker, and she always spoke with such authority. One day, after class, I asked her for some advice on improving my English. She smiled and said, "Blake, you know what's the most important thing when you speak? It's not about having perfect grammar or using fancy words. It's about owning your words. Speak confidently, even if you're not 100% sure." Native speakers don't always get everything right, but they don't hesitate. They own what they say. That stuck with me, and I realized that the more I tried to sound perfect, the more stiff and unnatural I sounded. Once I started speaking with more confidence, even if I made a mistake or two, people responded better. The key to this is to believe in your words. If you've learned something, don't second guess it. Instead of saying, "I think I know what I'm talking about," just say, "Here's what I think." Native speakers often speak with this kind of assurance. They don't always give disclaimers like, "I'm not sure," or "I could be wrong." Now, I'm not saying to be arrogant, but rather to trust yourself and speak clearly. This confidence will make you sound much more natural, and honestly, it'll help you feel better about speaking English. Speaking of confidence, I remember when I first started learning English in a new environment. At first, I was very shy about speaking with native speakers. I was always worried about making mistakes. Then, one day, I was talking to a classmate about an upcoming event, and I caught myself saying, "I don't know if I can do it." She immediately said, "Blake, just go for it. You've got this. You speak English better than you think." That was a huge turning point for me. It made me realize that if I kept worrying about my mistakes, I wouldn't get anywhere. From that day on, I decided to speak up more and embrace the mistakes because they're just part of learning. Now, let's talk about everyday phrases that will make you sound more native. In your day-to-day life, you probably say things like, "I'm sorry," or "excuse me," when you're trying to be polite. But what if you could say it like a native speaker? For example, instead of just saying, "I'm sorry," try saying, "Sorry about that," or "My bad." This is something I started doing after watching native speakers interact in real-life situations. I noticed that they never said "I'm sorry" unless it was really important. Most of the time they'd say "My bad" or just "Oops," and it's a lot more relaxed. These small changes in your language can make a huge difference in how you sound. I remember one time when my mom accidentally bumped into someone at the grocery store. Instead of saying, "I apologize," she just said, "Oh, sorry about that," in a friendly tone. The person smiled and said, "No problem at all." And that was it. No awkwardness, no long apology, just a simple, relaxed phrase. I realized that's the key to sounding more like a native speaker, using language that feels comfortable and natural in the moment. Another great expression is asking for help. Instead of saying, "Could you please assist me?" or "I would like help with this," you can say, "Can you give me a hand with this?" or "Mind helping me out?" These phrases are super common in casual conversations, and they make you sound more like a native speaker. I remember the first time I heard, "Can you give me a hand?" I was a little confused, but once I got the hang of it, it felt so much more natural than the more formal alternatives. Now, let's talk about listening. A huge part of sounding like a native speaker is being able to understand how native speakers speak. Listening to conversations, movies, and even podcasts in English will expose you to more casual phrases and expressions. But it's not just about hearing the words. It's about understanding how the words are used in different contexts. For example, if someone says, "That's lit," they don't literally mean it's on fire. It's just an expression to say something is amazing or exciting. These little things are what make you sound more like a native speaker. I started learning this the hard way when I was listening to a group of my friends talk about their weekend plans. They kept saying, "That party was so lit," and I had no idea what they meant. I thought they were talking about a candle or something. But after a while, I caught on. And now I use it too when I'm talking about something exciting. Native speakers often use phrases like, "That's awesome," "That's sick," or "That's cool" in different ways. And learning how to use them will make you sound much more natural. Let me share another personal story that shows how important it is to understand tone and context. A few months ago, I was hanging out with some friends, and one of them was talking about a new movie they had seen. They said, "It was the worst movie ever. It was so bad." At first, I thought they didn't like the movie at all, but then I noticed the smile on their face and the way they were laughing. They weren't serious. They were using sarcasm, which is very common in English. It was an example of how important tone and context are when speaking English. If you don't understand these things, you might miss the meaning or sound like you're misunderstanding something. That's why it's so important to listen and observe how native speakers express themselves in different situations. As we continue to explore how to sound more like a native speaker, we have to talk about expressions of surprise and excitement. Native speakers love to show how surprised or excited they are, using phrases like "no way" or "you're kidding." These expressions are so common, and they can make you sound much more natural. I remember a few months ago when I was telling my friend about a trip I had taken to a new city. As I was describing the beautiful views and the fun things I did, my friend kept saying things like, "No way," and "That sounds amazing." It made me realize that these kinds of expressions show excitement, and they are used in everyday conversations all the time. At first, I wasn't sure if I should use them because I thought they sounded a bit too casual, but after paying attention to how often my friends use them, I realized that they're just a part of the natural flow of a conversation. Native speakers don't always need to sound serious or formal. Instead, they allow themselves to sound enthusiastic and excited, which makes conversations more engaging and lively. This reminds me of a time when I went home to visit my parents. My mom had been planning a surprise birthday party for my dad, and when I found out, I couldn't believe it. I looked at her and said, "No way! You actually pulled it off?" And my mom laughed and said, "You always say that when you're surprised." It's one of those expressions I had picked up over time, and even my mom noticed how often I use it now. Let's talk about asking for clarification, which is another key to sounding more like a native speaker. Imagine you're in a conversation and someone says something that you don't quite understand. Instead of just saying, "I don't get it," or "Can you repeat that?" Try something a little more natural like, "Could you run that by me again?" Or, "I didn't quite catch that. Could you say that one more time?" These expressions show that you're listening and want to keep the conversation going without sounding too robotic. I remember the first time I heard someone say, "Could you run that by me again?" I was a little confused because it wasn't a phrase I'd learned in class. But when I asked my friend what it meant, they explained, "It just means, could you say that again in a more casual way?" I immediately started using it, and it felt so much more relaxed than just saying, "Could you repeat that?" Speaking of asking for clarification, I think back to a time when I was having a conversation with my dad about a new tech gadget he had just bought. I was asking him questions, but sometimes I didn't understand all the technical terms he was using. Instead of just nodding and pretending to understand, I asked him, "Could you break that down for me?" That's another great way to ask for clarification without making it awkward. It keeps the conversation going and shows that you're genuinely interested in understanding. And even if you're unsure, just asking politely can help you sound more confident. Now, let's explore how to talk about preferences in English. Native speakers often talk about their likes and dislikes, but they do it in such a casual way that it feels natural. For example, instead of saying, "I really like this," you can say, "I'm really into this," or "I'm a big fan of this." These kinds of expressions are commonly used to sound more relaxed and natural. I remember when I was chatting with a friend about a new show we were both watching. She said, "I'm obsessed with this show right now." It wasn't just, "I like it." It was much more passionate. So I started using, "I'm obsessed with it," and it really added energy to my sentences. People around me noticed how natural and energetic I sounded when I used it. One time my dad asked me what kind of music I liked, and instead of saying, "I like pop music," I said, "I'm all about pop music." My dad smiled and said, "That sounds more like you." It's these little adjustments that make a big difference in how you sound. Let's talk about complaining and venting. Native speakers don't always talk about their problems in a negative way. They often use humor or exaggeration to talk about things that bother them. For instance, instead of just saying, "I'm really tired today," you can say, "I'm totally wiped out," or "I'm exhausted beyond belief." These phrases show that you're tired, but in a way that feels more natural and conversational. I remember one day at work, I was really exhausted after a long week of studying. I told my friend, "I'm totally wiped out. I think I need a nap." Instead of just saying, "I'm tired," this expression made me sound more relatable and casual. It added personality to my speech, and my friend responded, "Yeah, I'm in the same boat." In fact, there's a funny story I want to share. Last summer, I was visiting my aunt's house, and after a long day of sightseeing, I was completely drained. I said, "I think I'm about to collapse here." My aunt started laughing because I had used such an exaggerated expression. It's something native speakers do often. It's not just about being tired, it's about using expressions that make the conversation sound lively and real. Instead of focusing too much on being formal, native speakers often add humor, exaggeration, and real-life personality to their conversations. Another way to speak naturally is by using phrases that make your conversations feel more personal and connected. For example, instead of saying, "I don't know," you could say, "I'm not sure, but I'll figure it out." Or, instead of, "Can I ask you a question?" you could say, "Mind if I ask you something?" It's these small changes that make your speech sound less like a textbook and more like a conversation. I remember a time when I was talking to my friend about a book I had just finished. Instead of saying, "I finished this book," I said, "I just wrapped up this book, and I gotta say, it was great." It was a more natural way of sharing information, and it made the conversation flow much easier. So far, we've covered a lot about sounding more natural by using everyday expressions. But let's dive a bit deeper into making small talk. Small talk is such an essential part of everyday conversations, especially in casual settings like at a coffee shop, at the gym, or even in class. As English learners, it's important to be able to chat about simple things without it feeling awkward. I remember when I first moved to college, I was a little nervous about meeting new people and making friends. The first time I sat down at the cafeteria, I didn't know how to start a conversation. Then, a classmate sat next to me and asked, "How's your day going so far?" It was such an easy question, but it made me realize that small talk doesn't need to be complicated. Instead of worrying about using perfect grammar, native speakers often start with simple things like, "What's up?" or "How's your day been?" These little questions are an excellent way to get a conversation going. At first, I felt like I needed to talk about something deep or meaningful, but I learned that sometimes just talking about the weather or asking about someone's day can be a great way to break the ice. For example, the other day, I was catching up with a friend who I hadn't seen in a while. The first thing I said was, "Wow, it's been forever. How have you been?" This wasn't a heavy question, but it was enough to spark a conversation. We ended up talking for over an hour about everything from our college life to funny things that happened in the past. We laughed a lot, and it made me realize that small talk doesn't always have to be about deep topics. It's about connecting with others in a relaxed way. And this reminds me of another experience I had a while ago when I was visiting my aunt's house. My aunt is an incredibly social person, and she always makes small talk with everyone. I remember she asked me, "How's work going? Are you enjoying it?" Instead of just saying, "It's fine," I decided to get a bit more into the details. I said, "Actually, I'm learning a lot, and I'm starting to feel more confident with everything I'm doing." And that little exchange turned into a much longer conversation where we talked about work, personal goals, and what my plans were for the future. It felt so natural, and I realized that even something as simple as talking about work can open the door for more meaningful conversations. Let's also talk about expressing opinions. This is something native speakers do all the time, whether they're discussing their favorite TV show, a new movie, or even food. The way we express opinions can really change the way we sound. Instead of saying, "I like pizza," a native speaker might say, "I'm crazy about pizza," or "I could eat pizza every day." These phrases sound much more relaxed and casual, and they help you sound like you're really invested in what you're saying. For example, when I was talking with my roommate about a new restaurant in town, I told her, "I've been dying to try that place." It's a much stronger expression than just saying, "I want to try it," and it shows that I'm excited. One time, my dad asked me if I'd seen a new action movie. I said, "I haven't, but I've heard it's awesome. I'm totally planning on seeing it this weekend." Saying, "I'm totally planning on seeing it" sounds much more natural than just saying, "I will see it." Native speakers love to emphasize their excitement and plans like that, and it gives your conversation more energy. Another way to sound more natural is by using fillers. Fillers are words like you know, or well, that don't really add meaning, but help the conversation flow. There's something that native speakers use all the time when they're thinking or trying to keep the conversation going. For example, if you're trying to think of what to say next, you might use a filler like, "Well, let me think about it." Or, when sharing an opinion, you could say, I feel like this movie is going to be amazing. These fillers help you sound more fluent and less like you're reading from a script. One time I was talking with a friend about a new job offer I had received, and I found myself saying, "Well, I'm not sure yet, but I think I might accept it." Instead of just saying, "Oh, I don't know if I will accept it," the filler made my speech sound more casual and confident. It wasn't a big deal, but using a filler like "well" made it easier for me to express my thoughts. In fact, a lot of the time when I'm chatting with my mom, I'll use fillers without even thinking. For example, when I was telling her about something I wanted to do this weekend, I said, "I don't know, I'm thinking of going to the park, but I'm not sure if I have enough time." It's so natural for me now to use those fillers, and they make me sound more relaxed and conversational. Another trick to sounding like a native speaker is responding with empathy. This is something that native speakers do automatically when they're having a conversation. When someone shares something with you, you can respond with phrases like, "I totally get that," or "I can't believe that happened to you." These responses show that you're not just listening to what they say, but you're connecting with their feelings. For example, my friend recently told me that they had a difficult week at work. I didn't just say, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." Instead, I said, "Ugh, I totally get that. Work can be really tough sometimes, especially when you have a lot going on." This response made the conversation feel more personal, and it showed that I understood how my friend was feeling. It's the same with my dad. When he tells me about something frustrating that happened during the day, I'll often say, "I know exactly what you mean. That's happened to me too." Using these empathetic responses helps me sound more connected to the conversation and makes it feel more natural. Native speakers don't just speak, they engage emotionally with the people they're talking to, which creates one of the most important skills in sounding like a native speaker is mastering casual conversations. Native English speakers often keep their language light and easy, even when discussing important things. Let me share a personal story about this. Back when I was in college, I had a group project with 3 classmates. One of them, Emma, was a native English speaker, and she had this natural way of making everyone feel comfortable during our discussions. For example, instead of starting with something formal like, "Let's begin discussing the project requirements," she said, "All right, so where should we start? Maybe we can list out a few ideas first." That casual tone instantly made the conversation feel more friendly and approachable. Inspired by her, I started practicing the same approach in my conversations. When I spoke to my mom about my college workload, I'd say, "Mom, this week's been crazy. I've got so many assignments, but I'm getting through them slowly." Instead of sounding robotic or overly formal, I focused on being expressive and adding a touch of personality. Words like crazy and phrases like getting through them slowly gave my sentences a natural rhythm. Here's a practical way to practice this. If you're talking about something that feels overwhelming, like work or studies, try saying, "I've been swamped lately, but I'm managing bit by bit." It's much more conversational than saying, "I am very busy, but I am completing my tasks." Native speakers often prefer to use imagery or relaxed expressions because it makes their speech feel real. Let's talk about interacting with family, which is something we all do, no matter where we're from. Family conversations are a goldmine for practicing natural English. For instance, when I help my dad fix things around the house, our chats are rarely formal. He might say, "Hey, can you grab me the wrench? It's on the counter." And instead of just handing it over silently, I'd reply, "Sure thing, but don't blame me if it doesn't work." That kind of playful banter keeps the tone light and shows personality, which is exactly how native speakers sound. Another time, my mom and I were discussing dinner plans. She asked, "What are you in the mood for?" I said, maybe pasta. But, I wouldn't say no to some pizza either. Notice how adding and I wouldn't say no to makes the sentence feel much more casual. Native speakers often layer their sentences with phrases that aren't necessary for meaning, but add a conversational flow. You can try using similar phrases like, honestly, I'm not sure what I feel like eating. Maybe something simple, or I could really go for some sushi right now. What do you think? Now, let's shift to making observations in real-life situations. This is another area where native speakers shine because they use descriptive language that feels effortless. For example, one day I was walking with a friend on campus, and we noticed a group of people setting up a stage for an event. My friend said, "Wow, that's going to be a big show. Look at all the lights they're setting up." That sentence wasn't complicated, but it was so natural because it combined observation with a little emotion. Wow and look at made it feel alive. Later that day, I tried something similar. When I passed by the library, I saw it. It was unusually crowded, so I said to my roommate, "The library's packed today. Everyone must be cramming for finals." It felt so much better than just saying, "The library is full." To practice this, you can start by making simple observations about your surroundings and then adding a little extra like, "It's so sunny outside today. Perfect weather for a walk." Or, "That cafe looks super cozy. We should check it out sometime." Speaking of reactions, when my younger brother told me he got a B on a test he thought he'd fail, I said, "That's awesome. See, I told you you're smarter than you think." Using phrases like, "That's awesome," or "I told you so," adds enthusiasm and energy to conversations, which is key to sounding natural. Let's not forget about sharing stories, which is one of the best ways to connect with others and sound native-like. The key is to make your story relatable and include small, natural details. For example, one of my favorite memories from high school is when my friends and I planned a surprise birthday party for our classmate. We were so worried about keeping it a secret, and I remember whispering to my friend, "Do you think she suspects anything?" To which he replied, "Not a chance. She's totally clueless." Later, when we surprised her, she was so shocked that she dropped her cake plate. We laughed about it for weeks. When telling stories like this, focus on making your sentences expressive and conversational. Instead of saying, "We planned a surprise party," you could say, "We were trying so hard to keep it a secret, but it was hilarious because everyone almost gave it away at some point." Finally, let's discuss expressing emotions, which is such an important part of sounding natural. Native speakers often use phrases to show how they feel in everyday situations. For example, if something exciting happens, they might say, "I'm over the moon," or "I'm so pumped right now." When I got my first job offer, I remember calling my mom and saying, "I can't believe it. It finally happened. I got the job." Her response, "I'm so proud of you." The back and forth of sharing emotions Let's talk about how rhythm can change the way you sound. Rhythm in English is about how you stress certain words and let others glide by more softly. This is something I learned the hard way. Back in college, I had a presentation in one of my communication classes. I was so focused on saying every word perfectly that I sounded a little robotic. After the class, my professor gave me some great advice. She said, "Blake, you're clear, but you need to let the important words pop and let the small words roll by naturally." That night, I practiced in front of my mirror. Instead of saying, "I am here to talk about the topic of innovation in education," I tried, "I'm here to talk about innovation in education." Notice how innovation stands out, and the other words flow more smoothly. This made my speech sound much more dynamic. You can try this too by practicing with sentences like, "I can't wait to see how it turns out," or "This is exactly what I needed today." Focus on which words feel naturally important and stress them just a little more. Another way to work on rhythm is through listening to how native speakers tell stories. My mom is a fantastic storyteller. She has this way of drawing you in with her tone. One time she was telling me about how she almost missed her train to work. She said, "Blake, I was running like crazy. My coffee spilled everywhere, and just as the doors were closing, I jumped in." Whew! The way she stretched. "Running like crazy," and then quickly said, "Whew," made the story come alive. Try mimicking this in your own stories. If you're late for something, instead of just saying, "I was late," you could say, "I was rushing like mad, my heart was racing, and I barely made it." Now, let's shift gears and talk about learning through family conversations, something we all experience. Growing up, dinner time in my house was like an impromptu English lesson. My dad loves asking questions like, "So, what was the most interesting thing you learned today?" At first, I'd give short answers like, "Not much," or "It was fine." But over time, I started using those moments to practice more expressive sentences. I'd say something like, "Actually, I learned something cool about how bees communicate through dancing. It's fascinating." Those little changes made me feel more confident expressing myself, even in casual settings. If you're talking to your parents or siblings, try using these prompts to make your answers more natural. "How was your day?" "It was pretty." "Good. I had a busy morning, but the afternoon was super relaxing." "What's on your mind?" "Oh, I was just thinking about that funny thing we saw last weekend. Remember the dog with the sunglasses?" The key is to match your tone to the situation. If you're with close friends, you can be more relaxed, saying things like, "Want to grab some lunch?" or "Let's hang out later. What do you think?" But in formal settings, you might say, "Would you like to have lunch together?" Or, "Let me know if you're available to meet later." By practicing these shifts in tone and language, you'll not only sound more natural, but also feel more confident in any situation. Speaking of real-life moments, let's talk about shopping. Shopping is one of those activities where you can practice English in everyday settings. I remember one time I was at a bookstore looking for a specific novel. I couldn't find it, so I walked up to the cashier and said, "Hi there, I'm looking for a book called The Night Circus. Do you happen to have it in stock?" The cashier smiled and replied, "Let me check for you. Can you spell the title for me?" That simple interaction taught me how to handle similar situations with ease. You can practice by imagining similar scenarios at a clothing store. "Excuse me, do you have this jacket in a medium size?" At a cafe. "Hi, could I get a cappuccino with oat milk, please?" Notice how polite phrases like, "Excuse me, do you have," and "could I," make your English sound more natural and respectful. Now, let's get into how native speakers use expressions to connect emotionally. When something great happens, they don't just say, "That's good." They go all in with phrases like, "That's amazing," or "You've got to be kidding me. That's awesome." I remember when my best friend got engaged. When she told me the news, I didn't just say, "Congratulations." Instead, I said, "Oh my gosh, that's incredible. Tell me everything. How did it happen?" That extra enthusiasm made our conversation feel so much more connected. You can practice this with examples from your own life. Let's say your friend tells you they've won a prize. Instead of just saying, "Nice," you could say, "That's amazing. What did you win? You must be so excited." Or if someone shares a funny story, you might respond with, "No way. That's hilarious. I can totally picture it." Now, let's revisit the idea of expressing surprise or excitement in casual moments. One day, my little brother came home with a lizard he found in the backyard. I was so surprised that I said, "Whoa, where did you find that?" And, "Does Mom know about this?" My tone wasn't just about the words, but also about how I said them. That combination of surprise and humor made the moment feel very real. If you want to sound like a native speaker, try adding variety to your reactions. Instead of just saying, "That's surprising," you could say, "No way, are you serious?" Or, "You're kidding, that's so unexpected." Finally, let's talk about how to adapt your English to different social settings. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a coffee shop. One day, a regular customer came in and said, "Hey Blake, can I get the usual?" That kind of familiarity felt so natural, and I loved responding with something casual like, "You got it. Coming right up." Compare this to when a new customer came in and said, "Hi, I'm not sure what to order. Do you have any recommendations?" My tone immediately shifted to being more helpful and polite. "Of course, if you like, something sweet. Our caramel latte is really popular." Let's keep going and explore even more ways you can sound like a native English speaker, with real-life stories and tips that you can apply in your own daily interactions. We're diving deep into the way we communicate, from how we express ourselves emotionally to how we adjust our language depending on the situation. This will help you sound even more natural in conversations, no matter who you're talking to. Let's start with something that everyone experiences: getting excited about something new. I remember when I first moved into my college dorm. It was my first time living away from home, and I was nervous, but also excited. My roommate Sarah came in and started unpacking. She said, "Blake, you're not going to believe this, but I just found this amazing cafe nearby." I could tell she was super excited, and her tone made all the difference. Instead of just saying, "I found a cafe," she added that excitement and shared it with me. This is what we do as native speakers. We use emotion to bring the conversation to life. When you're telling a story about something you've discovered or are passionate about, don't be afraid to show your excitement. For example, when you share something you've learned or experienced, try adding more feeling to it. "I just discovered this amazing recipe online. Oh my gosh, it's so easy and delicious. You have to try it." Instead of, "I found a cool place to eat," you could say, "I found this super cool spot, and it's even better than I expected." This expression of enthusiasm will make your English sound more natural, just like a native speaker. Now, let's shift to talking about everyday situations and using natural English in these moments. I remember once I had to call my mom about something that went wrong with my apartment. I said, "Mom, you're not going to believe this, but the sink is leaking again." I didn't just say the sink is leaking. I added that little phrase, "You're not going to believe this," to make it sound more like how we speak casually in English. Adding a phrase like that brings more personality and life to the conversation. It's the difference between saying something robotic and saying it in a way that sounds real. You can try this with your own daily conversations. For example, when you're talking about something small that happened, instead of just stating the fact, try something like, "I can't believe I forgot my keys again. I've got to stop doing this." Or, "Guess what? I finally found the book I've been searching for everywhere." You can also use these little expressions when something surprises you. "No way, that's unbelievable." Or when something makes you laugh. "That's hilarious. I wasn't expecting that at all." Speaking of sounding natural, let's talk about how we ask for clarification or give ourselves time to think in conversations. One of the best ways to sound like a native English speaker is by keeping your speech flexible. When we don't understand something, we don't just freeze. We ask questions like, "Could you say that again?" Or, "What do you mean by that?" One time, I was talking to a friend who was explaining something about a technical project. I didn't get it at first, so I said, "Wait, could you explain that part again? I didn't quite catch it." Instead of just staying silent or saying, "What?" I use that polite phrase to keep the conversation flowing. Here are a few ways you can ask for clarification naturally. "Sorry, can you say that one more time?" I'm not sure I understand. Could you explain it again? Wait, what do you mean by that? By using these expressions, you'll sound like you're engaged and ready to keep the conversation going. Lastly, let's discuss how to make your voice sound more relaxed when speaking. This might sound odd, but when we speak English in a more relaxed way, it feels more natural and effortless. I remember once I was giving a speech in front of a crowd, and I was so nervous. I was speaking too quickly and stumbling over my words. Then I remembered what my friend had told me. Blake, just take a deep breath, relax, and speak slowly. You don't need to rush. After I did that, my voice felt much more natural, and my words came out clearly. The lesson here is that when you take your time and speak slowly, it will help your English sound more natural and confident. These are just a few examples, but with time and practice, you can apply these tips to all of your conversations. Just remember, sounding like a native English speaker doesn't happen overnight. It takes patience and consistency. But when you make small changes like these, you'll notice a huge improvement in how naturally you speak. Feel free to practice these tips every day in your own conversations. The more you use them, the more comfortable and confident you'll become, and you'll see just how much your English improves. Keep practicing, and remember, I'm always here to guide you along the way. Let's start with a story about navigating tricky situations. Picture this. I was in college, and one weekend, I decided to join a group hike organized by my university. It sounded fun, but I didn't know many people in the group. When we were halfway up the trail, someone slipped and got mud all over their clothes. The group went silent for a moment, and it felt awkward. I decided to lighten the mood and said, "Well, now you've got a story to tell. Who else can say they survived? A mudslide on a college hike?" Everyone laughed, and the awkwardness disappeared. That small comment wasn't about being perfect with grammar or vocabulary. It was about connecting with people naturally. When you're in a similar situation, think about adding a little humor or saying something lighthearted. For example, "Well, that didn't go as planned, but at least it'll be a good memory." Hey, it happens to the best of us. Don't worry. These kinds of sentences show that you're approachable and make others feel comfortable. Plus, they make your English sound more conversational and less formal. Now, let's talk about using expressions to show understanding or empathy. This is something native speakers do all the time, especially in emotional situations. I remember one time when my mom called me after a long day at work. She sounded tired and stressed, and I wanted to let her know that I understood how she felt. Instead of just saying, "That's hard," I said, "Wow, that sounds like a really tough day. You must be exhausted." That small adjustment made the conversation feel warmer and more personal. Here are some phrases you can use to show empathy. "That must have been really challenging. I can only imagine how tough that was. I'm so sorry to hear that. How are you holding up?" These sentences aren't complicated, but they show that you're listening and that you care. When you add empathy to your conversations, it strengthens your connections with others and makes your English feel more natural. To wrap up, remember that sounding like a native English speaker isn't about perfection. It's about connection. Focus on how you deliver your sentences, use natural expressions, and bring your personality into your conversations. Practice. In real-life situations, whether you're chatting with friends, ordering food, or even telling stories, every little moment is an opportunity to grow and sound more confident. Most importantly, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we all learn. Keep practicing, stay curious, and enjoy the journey of improving your English skills. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found these tips and stories helpful. Until next time, keep speaking, keep learning, and keep sounding amazing. Take care.